hopefully some of you were with me last week. The background to this talk, the first half of the war in the Middle East, I covered last week, and tonight's lecture is the second, or the finale, I guess, of that campaign, picking up from the conquest of Jerusalem, as depicted in my cover slide there. So we'll start with a little bit of a quick recap that should take a few minutes, but basically gonna gloss over the contents of last week's slides just in case there was anyone who wasn't here for that, but in a little bit less details. Also look at the Egyptian Expeditionary Force again, in particular the change of leadership and the tools that Allenby had available to him for the campaign in Palestine and Syria. So we've already moved from Egypt into southern Palestine, taken Beersheba, managed to capture Gaza, and then on to Jerusalem. And that's where we'll pick up the story in a bit more detail. So operations in the Judean hills, Jordan Valley, and then how the Western Front becomes a bit of a distraction for Allenby. And then the final moves to finish off the Ottoman Army victory in the Middle East, and just finally touch on the legacy of that campaign. For anyone who doesn't know, both these two talks I originally gave, the best part of the first one nearly 10 years ago. I was aware that there was going to be a very strong emphasis on the Western Front, so I wrote a series of talks covering all of the other campaigns, which I gave during the National Army Museum's Friday Insights talks, to try and draw public attention to the fact it was a world war and that the world was involved and that conflict occurred outside of Europe as well. So these were a two-part pair of talks for focusing on the Sinai and then Palestine and Syria part of the war in the Middle East. There were separate talks that I looked at Mesopotamia and the Caucasus as well, because really to do this subject justice, it really justified a couple of talks. I mean, you couldn't do the whole Western Front really in a single talk and really cover it in any meaningful detail. So the same thing applies for this campaign. So a quick recap. As most of you Western Front Association folk will be very aware, one of the key triggers for the war is this tangled web of alliances. The sort of the tripartite agreement between Italy, Austria, Hungary, Germany on the one hand, and Russia, France, and Britain on the other. The Ottoman Empire wasn't part of that, though. They were initially neutral, and so certainly there was no immediate expectation that the Ottoman Empire would be involved when the war broke out. But the Ottoman Empire was in a really difficult political situation. Throughout most of the 19th century, they'd been losing large swathes of their territory, either to internal uprisings, independence movements, or the imperial ambitions of rivals, such as Italy and North Africa. And that all culminated in the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, which turned the empire into a constitutional monarchy and introduced multi-party elections. However, after the disastrous Balkan Wars of 1911 and 12, there was a coup in 1913, which created a one-party regime. It nominally was centered around the new Sultan, Mehmed V, but really he was a powerless figurehead. And the three Pashas, Enver Pasha, who was commander-in-chief of the Ottoman Army and Minister of War, Talat Pasha, the Grand Vizier and Minister of the Interior, and Ahmed Jamal Pasha, the Minister of the Navy, were the three-pronged nexus of power, if you will, within the Ottoman Empire. They were actually initially hostile to Germany because the German government had supported both the government of Abdul Hamid, and even worse as far as they were concerned, they supported the Austro-Hungarian Empire's annexation of former Ottoman territories in the Balkans. So the CUP had initially sought Britain's help to secure its remaining territories and to sort of re-establish its hold on power. but Britain actually instead proposed they become neutral and accept a sort of financial subservience in exchange for protectionism, which basically the Ottoman leadership was offended by. And this also, despite the fact that the Ottoman Empire had fought alongside Britain and France against Russia during the Crimean War. So the new leadership was pretty offended by this and turned to Germany instead. And also German finance in particular had been starting to get involved in trade, railroads, and military modernization. Indeed, Limon von Sanders was in the Ottoman Empire from 1913 onwards, helping them modernize. So when the war broke out in Europe in 1914, the Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity to try and regain its lost territories by siding with the Central Powers. There were three main geopolitical concerns, really, as far as Britain was concerned. The first was the proposed Berlin to Baghdad railway, which caused quite a significant amount of concern. Basically, if they had linked up from Berlin all the way to Basra, it would enable the Germans to obtain fuel from Middle Eastern oil fields, but also what they were quite keen on was being able to move troops rapidly by railroad down into the Persian Gulf, where they could actually threaten India. In fact, Maurice Jastrow wrote, "It was felt in England that if, as Napoleon had said to have remarked, that Antwerp in the hands of a great continental power was a pistol leveled at the English coast, then Baghdad and the Persian Gulf in the hands of Germany or any other strong power would be a 42-centimeter gun pointed at India." The Suez Canal, of course, Germany also coveted that for easier access to its East African and Pacific colonies, plus the added advantage in moving naval assets to the Indian Ocean and beyond. And as I just touched on, oil in particular, the Suez Canal was of vital importance for shipping, but as was having a neutral or aligned Ottoman Empire, Britain's most important regional concern was oil. Towards the end of the 19th century, the Royal Navy had begun switching from coal-powered fleet to an oil-powered one. In 1908, George Reynolds, an English geologist, discovered abundant oil reserves in Persia. And there was a public stock offering which created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And that was actually a major provider of oil for naval vessels. So Britain was really quite concerned that any other power would be in a position to threaten this oil supply. In fact, when the war does break out, the 6th Indian Poona Division are the first British Empire troops deployed into the Ottoman Empire in early of November 1914. They land in Mesopotamia at the Foul Landing, ostensibly to protect the oil fields of southwest Persia. So it was the Ottoman Empire not only declared war on the Allies on the 11th of November 1914, but Sultan Mehmed, speaking as the Caliph, declared it a holy jihad in the hope that millions of Muslims within the British, French, and Russian empires would rise up in support of their faith and cause internal conflict to split those empires from inside. German agents had also been working to support seditious uprisings, but actually in the end, few eventuate. In the 1915 Singapore mutiny of 850 British sepoys is a rare example. That lasted for a week and resulted in the death of 8 British officers and soldiers, 2 Malay officers, 14 British civilians, 5 Chinese and Malay civilians, and 1 German internee before it was put down by British forces and naval detachments. More than 200 sepoys were court-martialed and 47 were publicly executed. But as it says on the top of that slide, the words of his declaration, "Know that our state is today at war with the governments of Russia, England, and France and their allies, who are the mortal enemies of Islam. The commander of the faithful, the caliph of the Muslims, summons you to jihad." The first half of the campaign largely occurs within the confines of this map. If you look at the upper left, the Suez Canal, and Kantara in the middle, and Ismailia in the sort of southern sector of the canal there, that's where the initial Ottoman attacks come, as we'll look at in a second. And then going through the top along the coast, you'll see the railway, first to Qadia, Romani, Qadia, and then on to Bir al Mazar and El Arish. That is a key strategic part of this exercise. The middle of this area, I know the picture hasn't come out that well, but you'll see the words drift sand written all over this map. And realistically, as the next picture shows, a large area of the Sinai Peninsula is extraordinarily hostile environment, which is where these operations took place. So realistically, they were confined to that coastal plain below the interior desert uplands. It's a harsh desert environment, difficult enough to survive in the best of conditions, let alone military campaigning. There are two main problems present. The supply of reliable water is the difference between life and death, and the Ottoman Empire still had their water supply system of cisterns and wells, but the British didn't have a reliable one. The British had seized the initiative, as I mentioned, the foul landing in Mesopotamia, and they captured Basra in November of 1914. But Jamal Pasha had been ordered to create an army specifically to threaten the Suez Canal, and they mustered on the plains of Esdraelon, ready to attack. The Fourth Army under Jamal Pasha, and with the second in command, the German experienced officer Friedrich Kress von Kressenstein, as his chief of staff. So the Bikana Camel Corps were the first to intercept them in a skirmish on the 20th of November, where they lost 50% of their men. So it was an early victory for the Ottoman forces. They then attacked the canal in January of 1915 with a force of 20,000 strong, but an organized defense had been established under General John Maxwell, consisting of a series of posts with trenches and sandbag revetments and protected by barbed wire entanglements. Well, the British at the time had some 70,000 men in Egypt, mostly British Indian Army divisions, together with the 42nd East Lancashire Division, some local formations, and the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and 30,000 of these men were dedicated to this defense. The main attack of Kressenstein's 8th Corps fell across the central sector on the 2nd of February, with some of the attackers actually successfully crossing the canal using pontoons. But by the morning of the 3rd of February, the attack had been checked, and the gunnery of British and French ships supporting them, a strong counterattack of the 92nd Punjabis drove the Ottomans back across the canal, and by 3 a.m. the Ottoman attack had petered out. So they effected a full withdrawal, most of the army traveling back through northern Sinai in the direction of Beersheba and Gaza to reorganize. So in particular, the Luck Canal Brigade of the Indian Army had played a crucial role in defending the canal. A little bit of a geographical move away. The next step was the Dardanelles and Gallipoli campaign. Winston Churchill had proposed a strategy to try and knock the Ottoman Empire out quickly by attacking Constantinople directly through the Gallipoli Peninsula. He'd originally hoped to take it through a naval campaign in the Dardanelles, but the naval campaign lasted from February to March of 1915 and pounded the coastal fortresses of the Dardanelles, but unfortunately several British and French ships were sunk by mines. So a land campaign under the command of Sir Ian Hamilton was proposed with 78,000 strong Mediterranean expeditionary force. And on the 25th of April, they landed at Gallipoli at 3 separate locations. And that force consisted of British, Indian, Newfoundland troops, Australians, New Zealanders, and the French Orient Expeditionary Corps. After 8 long months, though, the campaign had failed to achieve any of its major objectives and cost over 250,000 casualties. So by January of 1916, the Allies withdrew from the Gallipoli Peninsula, which realistically means the campaign could be considered an Ottoman victory. Many of those troops were evacuated from Gallipoli to Egypt, where they began to create a pool of reserves that were originally intended to be transferred to the Western Front. But instead it was proposed that an overland campaign through Sinai and then potentially Palestine could drive the Ottoman army back through the Middle East instead. The force that remained in Egypt at the time had been involved in putting down the Senussi rebellion. That was one of the few Islamic groups which agreed the call to jihad and tried to attack British forces in Egypt through the Western Desert. But the force in Egypt was able to eventually put that down. Fighting throughout the summer of 1916, the EAF succeeded in pushing the German-led Ottoman Army units out of the area, beginning with the Battle of Romani and pursuit across northern Sinai through to August, the Battle of Megiddo in December, and in January 1917, the newly formed Desert Column completed the recapture of the Sinai at the Battle of Rafah, as shown in the map there. And there's a couple of very famous artworks in the Australian War Memorial collection, which depict the action at Romani and Megiddo. I mentioned earlier the need for water. So vital to the success of this campaign had been the construction of the railway to keep the supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements moving forward and evacuate the wounded back to Egypt. So alongside it, the pipeline was built to ensure fresh water could be pumped forward in keeping the troops and animals watered. Meanwhile, the Arab rebellion had been attacking the Hejaz Railway in its southern sector, constructed by Ottoman and German engineers in 1915. Arab irregulars, in fact, attacked on several occasions, notably on the 26th of March 1917, when Lawrence himself led an attack on the station at Aba el Nam. They captured 30 prisoners and inflicted 70 casualties, and again in November of 1917, when 2 locomotives were destroyed. Next came the attacks on Gaza itself. The victories in the Sinai campaign resulted in recapturing a substantial amount of Egyptian territory, but were followed in March and April by 2 defeats for the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, the first and second battles of Gaza in southern Palestine. Despite having over 30,000 men compared to the Ottoman defenders at about 19,000, Murray was unable to take advantage of an early surprise attack on Gaza, which pressed well into the outskirts of the city. Unsure of the strength of the defenders or how to consolidate their success, they were withdrawn as the light faded and would never be able to retake that first day advantage. In the intervening weeks, Gaza was substantially reinforced. So when Murray attacked with Eastern Force 3 infantry divisions supported by 2 mounted divisions in the second battle, the result was far from a close run thing. Strongly defended entrenchments with enfiladed machine gun fire and supported by accurate artillery led to a disaster for Murray's forces. The first 2 battles were a tough blow, really, for the British Empire, especially after having had those successes in the Sinai, and the Gaza War Cemetery is a testimony to those losses. In total, 509 killed, 4,500 wounded, and 1,500 missing. And the Ottoman defenders had only lost 400 killed and 1,300 wounded, which was an Ottoman victory. So as we'll see in a minute, I'll touch on the leadership. Basically, Murray is replaced by Allenby, and we'll look at that in the leadership section a little bit more in a moment. But rather than risk another failure at Gaza, he planned an extraordinarily strategic maneuver to encircle Gaza by taking Beersheba out in the desert. In the map, you can see it further inland from Rafah and Gaza. It would involve a long desert ride with difficult and low supplies of water and ammunition supplies, etc. It was a high-risk maneuver, but it caught the Ottoman Empire off guard. A battle raged throughout the day on the 31st of October 1917, and with light fading, the 4th and 12th Australian Light Horse, under the command of Grant, charged across 3 miles of open plain under Ottoman artillery and machine gun fire, with good support from British artillery, to be able to capture the trench lines defending the south and east of Beersheba, secure the town and its water wells, and open the road to Jerusalem. So Gaza fell in the following days. Having weakened the Ottoman defences, which had stretched almost continually from Gaza to Beersheba, it was finally captured on the 8th of November at the Battle of Tel al-Kuwelfi, and the Battle of Harera and Shuraya, and the 3rd Battle of Gaza, when the pursuit began. During subsequent operations, about 50 miles or 80 kilometers of former Ottoman territory would be captured as a result of those Egyptian Expeditionary Force victories. The Battle of Mughal Ridge followed on 10th and 14th of November, and the Battle of Jerusalem between the 17th of November and the 30th of December. The road to Jerusalem had been opened, and the Desert Mounted Corps pursued the Ottoman army into the Judean hills. Australian light horse screening and Lawrence's Arab army prevented the Ottoman forces from being able to outflank the main columns as well. So Jerusalem was occupied on the 11th of December, exactly 6 weeks after the capture of Beersheba. And out of respect for the city and its holy, sacred meaning to the three Abrahamic religions, and to prevent destruction, the Ottoman army withdrew from the holy city, and Allenby humbly dismounted, entering the city on foot through the Jaffa Gate, together with his officers, proclaiming he had arrived as a liberator, not a conqueror. Since your city is regarded with affection by the adherents of the three great religions of mankind, every sacred building, place of prayer of whatsoever form of the three religions will be maintained and protected, were key parts of his speech. I won't go into this in huge detail, but this is just to give you an idea. The Sinai phase and early part of the Palestine phase of this campaign involved a significant number of battles, and then of course the Dardanelles campaign on the side as well. So just looking at the Egyptian Expeditionary Corps in a little bit more detail, the Ottoman forces had a few early successes in Mesopotamia, such as forcing the British capitulation at the Siege of Kut. After the failure of the assault on the Dardanelles, troops from Gallipoli were evacuated to Egypt to create a pool of reserves ready to be transferred to the Western Front. But instead, they began being transferred from the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force into the force in Egypt for a Palestine campaign. Originally, that had been under the command of General Archibald Murray, as I mentioned earlier. On the 10th of March 1916, as the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, his initial orders had been to pursue the retreating Ottoman army that had attacked the canal to the Egyptian border, which he succeeded in doing. He had British, Indian, and Dominion troops at his disposal, but his failure to consolidate on those successes and go on to capture Gaza would lead to him being replaced by General Edmund Allenby. The Bull, as he was nicknamed, was a wily commander who knew how to get the best out of colonial troops and was also highly skilled in irregular warfare, having used colonial light horsemen to very good effect in the Boer War. Allenby's experience as commanding mounted units saw him place great faith in mobile warfare, and as we shall see, this led to him cleverly outmaneuvering the Ottoman army, as I mentioned before at Beersheba in particular. Allenby instituted major reorganizations of the EEF, dispensing with the ad hoc command and control used during 1916 and early 17, and creating three corps, 20, 21 infantry corps, commanded respectively by Lieutenant Generals Philip Chetwode and Edward Bulfin, and the Desert Mounted Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Harry Chauvel. Excuse me. There was also an increase in overall troop numbers, with 7 infantry divisions and 3 mounted divisions, plus artillery and mechanized units. The Desert Mounted Corps consisted of the 42nd East Lancashire Division, the 52nd Lowland, the Anzac Mounted Division, the Australian Mounted Division, the Imperial Camel Brigade, and the British Yeomanry Division. The Desert Column, which would become known as the Desert Mounted Corps from mid-1917, was really the Egyptian Expeditionary Force's primary offensive tool, as I mentioned, relying heavily on mobile warfare. The speed and maneuverability of the horses and camels was quite significant in many of the coming battles that we'll mention. I also mentioned the command of the Desert Mounted Corps comes to Australian General Harry Chauvel. Really, he was the ideal man for the job of this unit. He was not very outspoken. He had a calm, quick mind and was also intimately understanding of his men. He's perfectly happy speaking to their fellow officers or privates and troopers. He was a highly skilled cavalry commander who proved an ideal link, really, between the British general and the sometimes unruly Australians. Another key element in the war in the Middle East was the creation of the Arab Bureau, originally intended to harmonize the political activities of the Foreign Office, India Office, Committee of Defense, War Office, Admiralty, and Government of India. It became a highly effective intelligence gathering organization, which drew on many pre-war regional experts such as archaeologists and Orientalists and their existing networks of contacts. But as Bruce Westrate wrote in his 1992 History of the Arab Bureau, the agency had subsequently borne much of the blame for Britain's terrible mishandling of Middle Eastern policy during and shortly after World War I. In order to further undermine Ottoman strength, British intelligence targeted Arab nationalism, and people like the Austrian Alois Musul, Sharif Hussein, and T. Lawrence would be key figures in this partnership. On the basis of the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, an agreement between the British government and Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, the Arab revolt was officially initiated at Mecca on the 10th of June 1916, with the aim of creating a single unified and independent Arab state, which would stretch from Aleppo in Syria to Aden in Yemen, which both the British had promised to recognize. But this was in conflict with the agreement that they would make with France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and also the aims of British supporters of Zionism. Allenby also had several modern tools of warfare at his disposal, which the Ottomans did not have, certainly not in anywhere near the number. For example, armored cars provided light armored mobility for scouting and harassing isolated units. Motorbikes provided rapid mobility for dispatching and scouting. Tanks had begun arriving in Palestine between the second and third battles of Gaza. Mobile radio trucks gave communications advantage, in particularly radio being able to link up with pilots. And the British and Australian pilots of the Royal Flying Corps and Australian Flying Corps were rarely challenged for aerial superiority. Also, Indian cavalry had begun to arrive. Indian units fighting on the Western Front had begun to bolster the DMC's mounted strength, and including the Jodhpur, Mysore, and Hyderabad Lancers, and more units arriving from the Western Front to really help bring Allenby's numbers back up after the capture of Jerusalem. So on to the Judean Hills, Jordan Valley, and Jericho. We picked the story up really with that announcement I mentioned Allenby making at the Tower of David, and the important emphasis he'd placed on respect and appearing as a liberator, not a conqueror. Here's a wonderful photo of him reading that proclamation at the Tower of David in Jerusalem. And just as an interesting side incidents, there seems to be a photo taken at almost the exact same moment from a right angle directly in the crowd, looking at him from the front on. So after Jerusalem had been captured, consolidating that success was a hugely important responsibility. It had also been a hugely symbolic political and military success. The war hadn't necessarily been going brilliantly. The Battle of Palestine had been raging. Passchendaele had been raging on the Western Front, and causing huge numbers of casualties. The war on the Western Front was not necessarily showing any promises of successes at that time. So capturing Jerusalem was a real morale boost for the Allies, and in particular the British Empire forces. Allenby now found himself fairly stretched, though, with a defensive line from the north of Jaffa to just beyond Jerusalem. He still faced the entire Ottoman 8th Army at Tel Kurum and the 7th at Nazareth. Allenby's next strategic move was to organize the capture of Jericho to the northeast of Jerusalem, despite the fact that this area, such as the ground around the Nabi Musa monastery, was heavily wired to slow Allenby's highly mobile mounted forces. But he wished to extend his right to include Jericho in the northern parts of the Dead Sea, as depicted on this map. You can see that line Jaffa appearing in the upper left, Jerusalem in the mid-right of the map. Spring 1918 really saw the EEF expand its operations eastward into the Jordan Valley, followed by two abortive attempts to reach Amman and cut the railway line south to the Hejaz in order to aid the Arab revolt. By mid-February 1918, the 53rd Welsh and 60th 2nd London Divisions, with the 1st Australian Light Horse and New Zealand Mounted Rifles in support, attacked German and Ottoman defences to the east of Jerusalem, helped by their 20 Corps. As the infantry attacked the Talat el-Dum and Jebel Ektaif, the mounted brigades progressed towards the Jordan Valley from Bethlehem. The New Zealand Mounted Rifle Brigade successfully attacked positions at El Montar and a strong position protecting Nebi Musa, while on the first light horse reached the Jordan Valley and entered Jericho on the 21st of February. That was about 100 years to the day of when I first delivered this talk. Two unsuccessful attacks were made to capture Amman and to capture Ez Salt in March and April of 1918. But by late March, the German spring offensive was underway, and a heavy demand for troop reinforcements to be sent to Europe really cut back on Allenby's offensive capabilities and options. So there's a brief emphasis on the Western Front. The opening months of 1918 saw the EEF essentially transformed as all but one of its infantry divisions had 3/4 of their British troops replaced by Indian sepoys, with the British troops from the EEF sent to the Western Front to deal with the German spring offensive. Russia's withdrawal from the war had freed over 50 divisions for Germany, and they launched a huge offensive on the Western Front, making use of their new rapid-moving stormtroopers, and they made their deepest advances either side had made of the Western Front since 1914. The German army struggled to maintain this momentum, though, mainly due to logistical issues and some excellent use of elastic defense by Allied units on the Western Front. And the Allies concentrated their defenses around key strategic targets, such as the rail junction of Amiens, and allowed non-strategic ground to be given up without wasting men or resources. And worse for Germany, with American troops arriving in number, they'd suffered heavy casualties, taking a lot of non-strategically valuable land, and within a few weeks, the real threat would pass. The reality was, as summer of 1918 approached, the Central Powers were now under heavy pressure on the Western Front, in Italy and in the Middle East. The units that stayed behind in the Middle East, though, weren't idle. They'd been scouting and skirmishing. That had become the order of the day. In particular, the armored cars proved highly useful in harassing the enemy and keeping abreast of their movements and maneuvers. And the summer of 1918 was also spent training the newly arrived Indian sepoys, many of whom had little combat experience. So integrating them into the EEF's existing formations and training them in particular in the important aspects of combined arms warfare that they'd be relying on in the coming offensive. So it was also an opportunity to consolidate defenses around territory already taken. So here we see on the right, men of the Black Watch guarding the defensive line literally all the way into the sea. So they're at a beach near Asuf, which is near modern-day Tel Aviv in modern-day Israel. The Indianization of the EEF allowed them to launch a major offensive against the Ottoman Army, which would begin on the 19th of September 1918, with Allenby using his infantry to drive open a gap along the coastal plain north of Jaffa, through which he would then unleash mounted troops. So that takes us into the beginnings of the Palestine and Syria campaign. The Ottoman army was really on the defensive by the late summer of 1918. Then a severely depleted force, suffering disease, manpower shortages and material problems, lack of ammunition, supplies and food, and really starting to operate in territory where the locals weren't necessarily particularly liking or supportive of them. They were forced to retreat northward through Palestine and regrouped at Megiddo, hoping to be able to reform for a counterattack. But by some irony, the site of the battle corresponds with the supposed location of the biblical Battle of Armageddon, which was predicted to occur in the apocalyptic end times, according to the book of Revelation 16:16. For the religious and superstitious alike, this might have seemed like some kind of omen, perhaps even the final battle. However, at a more practical level, the Ottoman forces had really moved themselves into the exact position Allenby had hoped for. He sought to trap them, prevent any escape routes, and allowing him to launch a coordinated attack, utilizing his cavalry, infantry, artillery, armored vehicles, and aircraft in an attempt to annihilate them in one fell swoop. The Indianized EEF launched that offensive, as I mentioned, on the 19th of September. Allenby used his infantry to drive open the gap along the coast, and then the mounted troops would be able to break through the lines. As the infantry and artillery closed in on the Ottoman positions, The Desert Mounted Corps used deception and speed to encircle them, preventing any escape routes. The Ottoman and German armies were trapped, and all the Entente forces held aerial and numerical superiority in the area. So the Battle of Megiddo was fought in the Judean hills, the Jezreel and Jordan valleys, and the hills of Moab in what is modern-day Israel. It occurred from the 19th to the 25th of September and really became the climactic battle of the Sinai and Palestine campaign. The German and Ottoman forces were commanded by Otto Liman von Sanders and Mustafa Kemal Pasha, and as I mentioned, found themselves encircled. In an extraordinary piece of maneuver warfare, his collective assets began to launch devastating lightning attacks that would preempt the notion of German blitzkrieg of the next war. The Ottoman defenders were unaware of how well positioned for attack the EEF had been, and Allenby launched his lightning attack upon them. After being softened up by heavy artillery bombardments, at one point firing 1,000 rounds a minute for 15 minutes straight, after being softened up, the British and Indian infantry divisions made crushing forward assaults on the 7th Army at Sharon and Nablus, whilst receiving close air support from RAF and AFC aircraft. And at the same time, the Desert Mounted Corps used that deception to be able to position themselves around all the possible routes of withdrawal behind them. As at Beersheba, success relied on the cavalry envelopment of the Ottoman flank. The difference was the Ottoman forces had expected another attack at Gaza, but instead it had come at Beersheba. In this instance, they had expected the attack in the Jordan, and instead it came on the Mediterranean coast. Various ruses to give the impression the entire Desert Mounted Corps was still in the valley had been used. Fires had been lit at night in vacated camps, fake horse lines complete with rows of dummy horses were maintained, and the number of patrols was increased. Meanwhile, buildup of EEF forces in the coastal sector was hidden as much as possible. Camps were disguised, cooking on open fires banned, and large troop movements were permitted only at night. In anticipation of the major offensive being prepared, several smaller battles had been fought to position his chess pieces ready for the final blow. Vital to these operations was the speed and movement of the cavalry of the Desert Mounted Corps, but also vehicles, in particular armored cars, and even more importantly, the ability of commanders to stay close to their men using their staff cars. The Battle of Sharon started at 4:30 a.m. on the 19th of September, with one of the heaviest artillery bombardments in the Middle Eastern War. For over a quarter of an hour, thousands of shells rained down upon the stunned Ottoman defenders on the plains of Sharon. Over 15,000 shells had been fired in a quarter of an hour. Even the most disciplined soldiers would struggle to maintain themselves under such a bombardment. The accurate and deadly creeping artillery barrages preceded the British and Indian infantry of 21 Corps, attacking in formation and quickly punching holes through the stunned and disorganized Ottoman defenders. The Desert Mounted Corps then poured through the gaps opened in the line and into the Ottoman rear positions where they could cause havoc. They advanced many miles, capturing key strongholds at Afula, Baisan, and Jenin, and sweeping through the region, taking thousands of prisoners, and in the process also going on to secure Nazareth, Haifa, and Samak. Within days, the cavalry had encircled the bulk of the Ottoman army in northern Palestine and captured over 75,000 demoralized Ottoman soldiers. Whilst the British and Indian divisions had been battering the armies at Sharon and Nablus, the Arab rebels had continued to launch their attacks on the Ottoman lines of communication and their railways, cutting troop movements and their main method of withdrawal. Having achieved the desired breakthrough at Sharon by the evening of the 19th of September, the Battle of Nablus was begun with 20 Corps attacking the Ottoman army's well-defended front line in the Judean hills. A mixed mounted and infantry detachment known as Chaytor's Force captured the Jordan River crossings. At the same time, the Ottoman Fourth Army came under sustained attack in the hills of Moab, and at As-Salt and the Amman by mounted units. The battle raged throughout the night and well into the next day, allowing the 21 Corps to begin outflanking the 8th Army. Meanwhile, the Desert Mounted Corps completed their encirclement of the Ottoman army, securing the important defiles of the Carmel Range. The cavalry had driven up the coast, seizing key junctions, stations, and passes, whilst the infantry advanced from south and southeast, rolling up any units that wished to make a stand. By the middle of the 20th, most Ottoman forces were in retreat. The Ottoman Eighth Army had ceased to function as an organized force, and communication was virtually lost. Its men were now focused on a futile flight for safety to the north or east. The next day, the Seventh Army had also collapsed under the relentless pressure of the Allied advance, and Ottoman soldiers were beginning to surrender in their thousands. As I mentioned briefly, air superiority, the Royal Air Force, as it was now remodeled as, and the Australian Flying Corps played a key role in this battle, bombing the Ottoman Army and Army Group headquarters and cutting their lines of communication with the front. This meant that few Ottoman forces were receiving any kind of orders at all, and chaos absolutely reigned. Nablus had been captured by the ground troops, whilst a devastating aerial bombardment cut off the line of retreat along the Wadi El Farah road. Waves of British and Australian aircraft passed over the Ottoman column of retreat every 3 minutes. They'd prepared enough ammunition to sustain an aerial attack for up to 5 or 6 hours, but the Ottoman force had been completely annihilated within 60 minutes. Scattered along a stretch of over 9.5 kilometers or 6 or 7 miles, lay the wreckage of hundreds of vehicles, wagons, guns, and dead or wounded troops and horses in a scene that would be eerily similar to the one repeated as the Iraqi army retreated from Kuwait over 70 years later. Ottoman forces around Nablus had been broken by the 21st, allowing 20 corps to round up prisoners. The Australian Light Horse had been upgraded to cavalry after the Battle of Beersheba, and now armed with sabres, they had the opportunity to use them in brutally overrunning German and Ottoman troops at Samak. Some elements of the Ottoman 7th were deployed away from the destruction at Sharon and Nablus and still posed a risk. So receiving word of the losses at those battles, they again began their northward retreat. And again, British and Australian aircraft caused heavy losses along their retreating columns. As the New Zealanders of Chaytor's force finally took Salt and Amman on the 23rd, the New Zealand Mounted Rifle Brigade and the Anzac Mounted Division would play an important supporting role in the Jordan Valley during this offensive. The last desperate elements of the Fourth Army had reached Ziza, finding their path blocked by the Anzac Mounted Division. At Megiddo, the Entente allies had inflicted losses on the Ottoman army of over 25,000 killed or wounded or captured, and effectively ended the Ottoman army's ability to continue the war. The way to Damascus, Beirut, and Aleppo now lay open. The Fourth Army found themselves now squeezed between the Desert Mounted Corps and some of the forward columns of the Arab irregulars who were continuing to outflank them up the east. As they sought to retreat northwards, they found themselves pursued by those Arabs and then facing the Allies on the other side. The Arab irregulars held a strong hatred for the Ottoman Turks after years of occupation, so the Fourth Army decided to surrender en masse to the Desert Mounted Corps rather than potentially face retribution and slaughter at the hands of the angry Arabs. Stragglers that had escaped the destruction at Megiddo continued to filter north in the forlorn hope of regrouping once more. What followed was one of the most remarkable military pursuits in history. Chauvel led the Desert Mounted Corps northward, covering 167 kilometers or about 140 miles in 3 days, crossing the Golan Heights. The Arab irregulars followed close behind, with Lawrence desperate for them to reach Damascus first. The stragglers that had escaped the destruction at Megiddo continued to filter north in the forlorn hope of regrouping, or perhaps even escaping back to Turkey. What followed was one of the most remarkable military pursuits, as I mentioned, Chauvel led the Desert Mounted Corps forward, and the Arab irregulars were close on their flank. Of course, the Arabs had been seeking to arrive in Damascus first. Lawrence was hoping that in taking the city, his promise to the Arabs that it would become the capital of their new unified nation would be resting on them having liberated it by his Arab army. But this promise also clashed with the secretly agreed Sykes-Picot agreement that Britain and France had made 2 years earlier. As it happened, on the morning of the 1st of October, the most advanced Allied unit was the 3rd Australian Light Horse Brigade under the command of Major Harry Alden. He'd been ordered to pursue the column of retreating Ottoman troops, and they passed through Damascus before him, continuing northward. So Alden led his men and horses after them, entering Damascus, intent on continuing the pursuit out the other side of the city. But as they passed the town hall, he was stopped by a large local delegation and obliged to accept the city's formal surrender, much to the annoyance of Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence. He had planned a grand ceremony in support of the Arab insurgents. He arrived into the city a few hours later, and he was so annoyed that he virtually wrote the Australians out of his retelling of these events. Between the 19th of September and the 2nd of October, the Australian Mounted Division alone had taken over 31,000 prisoners, with only the loss of 21 killed and 71 wounded. Meanwhile, the 3rd Indian Lahore Division headed to Beirut and the 7th Indian Meerut towards Baalbek, securing both of these cities. Homs was also captured on the 16th of October. Lawrence's arrival in Damascus allowed Chauvel to continue his rapid pursuit north, and they would cover a further 300 kilometers on to Aleppo, which soon fell with little resistance on the 25th of October. The Allies had pushed the Ottoman Army back over 1,000 kilometers, or some 620 miles, between 1915 and 1918, with much of the progress being in the summer and autumn of 1918. 5 days later, the Ottoman army totally capitulated, suing for peace. This climactic battle on the plains of Armageddon saw the end of the 600-year-old Ottoman Empire, the end of some 1,400 years of Islamic rule, and victory for the Allies in the Middle East. The number of brigades and units that served in this campaign is too great to go into in huge detail. But by the end of this operation in September 1918, this was the sort of structure of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, with those infantry and mounted divisions listed there on the right that I mentioned earlier. If anyone does have any specific units or regiments or battalions that they're interested in, my email address will be up at the end, and I'm more than happy to give you specific divisional orders of battle, or at least confirm if a unit you're interested in was involved in this campaign. So in all, the Sinai, Palestine, and Syria campaign would cost some 61,000 casualties for the British Empire, and 16,000 killed or missing, 43,000 wounded, and some 1,300 taken prisoner. Over 500,000 men had been hospitalized from disease, and 5,000 of those had died. The Ottoman army had taken over 130,000 battle casualties, twice the number, with 15,000 killed, 34,000 wounded, 10,000 missing, and 78,000 captured. Megiddo and the pursuit northward came at a relatively light cost to the EEF, though, with only 5,500 casualties from the summer of 1918 onwards. In March to April of 1919, a large bulk of the EF was committed to the suppression of the Egyptian revolution, restoring control through the liberal use of force. But the shift from wartime operations to post-war imperial policing proved very unpopular with the EEF's rank and file, particularly the volunteers of the Australian and New Zealand forces. This delayed their demobilisation and led to large-scale unrest in many units by May of 1919. Following the rapid demobilisation of most of its British and Anzac units, the remnants of the EEF, by then largely an Indian Army formation, acted as an army of occupation in the former Ottoman Levant until the mid-1921, when they began being replaced by new civil authorities of the new Syrian and Palestinian mandates. Of course, humans were not the only casualties in the war in the Middle East, and one of the listeners last week did ask me about the horses used in this campaign. Some 120,000 Australian horses had been sent to serve overseas, with approximately half being sent to India and around 10,000 to France and the rest to the Middle East. Australian quarantine requirements concerned with disease being imported back into Australia and threatening Australia's vital livestock economy, and of course the cost of repatriation to Australia, really prohibited any kind of return of those animals. And a local sale was ruled out as local animal welfare standards weren't considered to be sufficient, and there was a fear of a large number of war horses being used by a local army. So the horses were classified by age and health, with some of the younger ones sold to other imperial armies, particularly the Indian Army, and those unsaleable, unfortunately, being destroyed. The majority of the horses that have been used in Belgium and France were sold to locals. The war in the Middle East was formally ended on the 30th of October 1918 when the Ottoman Minister of Marine Affairs, Rauf Bey, agreed to sign the Armistice of Mudros aboard HMS Agamemnon in Mudros Harbour off the coast of the Greek island of Lemnos. The Ottomans agreed to surrender all garrison and territory outside of Anatolia and permitted the Allies to occupy the fortresses of the Dardanelles and Bosphorus. The armies were demobilized and the Allies occupied all of their former territories in the capital, Constantinople. After the Paris Peace Conference from January to June of 1919, T.E. Lawrence would push forward for his campaign for a Hashemite kingdom of Arabs. Lawrence encouraged Prince Faisal to come to the Paris Peace Conference at Versailles to represent the Arab cause, and the British War Cabinet designated Lawrence to work with him. But the deal had already been done behind the back between the British and French, betraying all of their hopes. All former Ottoman territories were partitioned, severing the Turkish and Arab regions. The Turkish nationalist movement had been triggered by the War of Independence and resulted in the modern Republic of Turkey. In the aftermath of the war, the League of Nations was supported to deal with many unresolved issues, and the Sykes-Picot Agreement between France and Britain saw France establish a mandate over Syria and Lebanon, and the British over Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. The nationalist movements would soon begin arising to achieve independence for the most of these states in the coming decades, but conflict continues to affect this region. As you can see from this map, the division between Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Palestine, etc., never took into account the ethnicity or the religion of the groups of people living within them. And lines, as the famous book title says, lines literally drawn in the sand, dividing communities and creating hostilities between new co-nationals of different faiths and different ethnicities. Lawrence had actually made a proposal based on religion and ethnicity, which the borders of which reflected his awareness of imperial interest in the local Sunni, Shia, Christian, Armenian, and Kurdish populations, and of course the desire to meet that original promise to Faisal. But instead, we went with the Sykes-Picot dividing lines, the B zone, A zone of protectorates, and as a result, the Middle East has been in conflict almost for the entire 100 years or more now since the end of that war. This is a list of all of the wars that have occurred in the regions affected by those mandates. I'll just quickly mention my book. It's coming out hopefully around next summer. Scholars, Soldiers and Spies. It's about the use of espionage, particularly amateur espionage, the likes of the archaeologists of the Arab Bureau in Britain's imperial successors. And that will be available hopefully next year. And also just quickly, my freelance business that I'm working up at the moment, available to do freelance history work, research, support with things like talks or research, writing public program, and also some, if people need help with museum consultancy, particularly small museums like regimental museums, anything to do with collection management or documentation, outreach, education type things. So my website hopefully will be up and running soon. But if you have any questions about anything like that, please do take down my email and get in touch. But thank you very much. I've gone over by a couple of minutes, but I'm happy to stay back for questions. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and I really appreciate everyone staying with me and joining me for this talk. So thank you.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely tremendous. Really glad that we have had you along to give us two excellent talks on a subject that we've not covered previously. So, ladies and gentlemen, as is tradition, perhaps we can show our appreciation to Robert by a silent round of applause, which means hitting the hands up button on Zoom, the raise hand button on Zoom. And Robert, I can confirm that that is an overwhelming round of applause. You can't hear it, but it's there. So thanks very much indeed.
I appreciate that.
No worries. Now I've actually got 3 questions in already. So let me just, Jeffrey, thanks for joining us. I can see you're here, and I can hear you. So do you want to fire in your question, Jeffrey?
My question was really something that you mentioned in passing, really, which was the raids on Es-Salt, or Es-Salt, I'm not quite sure. What extent do you think they represent a real failure on Allenby's part, or was it really a highly successful feint to concentrate Turkish attention deep inland, as it were, when the main thrust was going to come up along the coast?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, actually. It isn't a hugely strategic target. They're really trying to effectively stretch all of the operations to the east of Jerusalem are both primarily aimed at supporting the Arab revolt's thrust up that flank, but also stretching out the Ottoman lines, the 8th and the 7th in Palestine and the 4th over in the east, trying to stretch out and break open both the lines of communication and support. So specific raids, it is a raid east of the Jordan River. If I think assault is the Australian mounted, Anzac mounted, and the 60th Infantry. And I think the Imperial Camel Corps were also involved. Chauvel was actually involved in commanding that. But realistically, they were looking for a launching point for operations against the railway junction at Dera. So it didn't have to be as salt. And actually, I think when they arrived there, what was that? That was late April. When they arrived there in late April, I think they found that the Turkish defense around Es-Salt was much stronger than they'd anticipated. So in fact, the Turks do launch counterattacks. So realistically, I think as far as Chauvel was concerned, I think he was thinking that the amount of resistance that they met was probably much greater than they'd really anticipated, and the strategic value of taking it wasn't worth the risk. So hence the withdrawal. But also this part of the campaign is coming at that time when Allenby's overall forces had been slightly weakened by the return of men to the German spring offensive. So it's a little bit more that softly looking for opportunities to stretch the main Turkish line out, and if they can find that jumping off point to attack Dera, the railway junction at Dera, then they'll do that.
It also has a certain notoriety, and as far as I know, at least according to a book called Allenby's Guns, it was the only significant loss of British artillery in the whole Palestine campaign. Yeah,
I think it's fair to say that they were. I mean, I think British intelligence overall was far more successful and far more capable in this campaign than the Ottoman. Obviously the Ottomans got caught out on many occasions, but I think on this particular occasion, it's fair to say that they'd underestimated the defensive strength at Es-Salt.
Super. Thanks very much for your question there, Geoffrey. Right, let me ask William Franklin, if you want to unmute yourself there, William.
Rob, thanks very much. Just to point out, my grandfather was in the Desert Mounted Corps, Sherwood Rangers Yeomanry. I think that was 5th Division. My question is, T.A. Heathcote, who wrote a book on British Field Marshals, claimed that Allenby was the British Army's last and greatest captain of horse. Is that claim justified?
Yeah, I've read that. Just as a quick incidental, I did mention this last week, so anyone who's joined back will have heard me say it last week. But as for yourself, your personal connection, one of the reasons why I've studied this campaign in a great deal of depth and spoken about it on many occasions. In fact, I did another talk which was specifically about the use of light horse in yeomanry, and looked at the yeomanry and the specific units in a lot more detail. I think you would probably enjoy that, because we do go into all of the different yeomanry units and where they're involved and what they do. So my great uncle was a remount trooper for the Australian Light Horse, and he served in the all the way through from Egypt to the end of the war, looking after horses and supplying horses for the Australian Light Horse. So I have that personal connection as well. I think it's a fair claim. I think obviously a lot of the cavalry commanders that ended up on the Western Front didn't get an opportunity to show what they might have been capable of doing. Cavalry wasn't really able to be utilized to its full extent in that campaign, as opposed to the Middle Eastern campaign, where it's an absolutely decisive weapon. I think he understands cavalry, and Chauvel in particular is a very capable commander, and also the men under him like Grant. You know, he's got some very, very good military minds and military horse minds with him. He had used both irregular and regular cavalry in the Boer War, and he understood how to exploit open land, the veldt in South Africa in the case, and the plains and deserts of the Middle East. And I think that particularly the build-up and the consolidation to the Battle of Megiddo, and then the extraordinary use of maneuver warfare in that battle, and then subsequent operations, really does show this is one of the last great cavalry campaigns before mechanization. And the irony is, actually, he is a great cavalry commander or utilizer of cavalry, but he does, as I mentioned, also have armor and armored vehicles and motorcycles and aircraft coming in. And what he shows, and you do wonder if the Germans in the development of Blitzkrieg had looked at what he succeeded in doing, but his use of combined armed warfare, of using horses and tanks and armored cars, really he's the crossover point where the last sort of great cavalry campaign and the first great mechanized campaign are occurring at the same time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for that question, William. Thanks, obviously, Rob, for the full answer there. Got a couple of questions from people who are unable to join us by video link. Do people visit the area? What's the position regarding battlefield tours? Is it done? Is it possible? Is there anything to see?
I think before the Syrian war, it was much more common. I had sort of contemplated going in the centenary period, and most of you will probably be aware the Syrian civil war really kicked off actually about 12 years ago. So throughout most of the centenary period, I think the number of tourists has declined. I do know the number of Australians that visit southern Palestine or southern Israel, and in particular Beersheba, is quite large. There's a large number of Australians, not just descendants of those who served and fought there, but it has a little bit like, I think, Anzac Cove and Villas Bretonneux become a little bit of a not holy pilgrimage, but a site of remembrance of importance to Australians as a nation, and a lot of people do visit that area. I think particularly once you get into the northern parts of this campaign, Megiddo, etc., I think tourism to that area has probably declined. I'm not an expert. I would say if you are interested, obviously speak to the great tour companies like Ledger and what have you, who do a lot of battlefield tours, and some of the more independent ones. I know Gallipoli campaign tours are still carrying on as before. So if you are interested, apart from anything else, it's an incredibly culturally rich place, and alongside the First World War, there's beautiful Crusader castles and places like Crac de Chevalier and sites from the biblical times and what have you. So there are some extraordinary things to see in the Middle East, and hopefully we'll see peace return soon, and places like Palmyra and Syria can be visited again. But I think those conflicts have probably dampened enthusiasm a little bit.
Okay, thanks for that. And also another question, this one from Brian Matthews. Brian has asked, how long did the Turkish prisoners remain as captive after the end of the war? Is that something that you've got a handle on, Tom?
I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that, I'm afraid. I do think there were still repatriations going on in sort of 21, 22, as far as I can recall. I should have looked that up. I think I was actually asked that exact question when I did this talk, whatever it was, 6, 7 years ago. So I should have probably looked it up. But I do think I've got a feeling that there was a reluctance. This is now me working on an old memory, but I think there was a reluctance to return troops to Turkey whilst the Turkish Civil War was still going on. But obviously, keeping prisoners of war requires keeping soldiers paid and employed to look after them. So I think once the demobilizations were happening, the repatriations were sort of hurried up. If anyone knows better, do feel free to comment. I honestly can't remember the exact dates of when the final prisoners were returned.
No worries. I'm sure Brian will be happy with that answer there. So thanks for that, Rob. Right, we've got inevitably a couple of questions about Lawrence of Arabia.
Lawrence of Arabia.
So Angela is going to ask her question, but before you answer Angela's question, I've got another question from another guest who can't get on the video call. So Angela, do you want to just hit us with your question? I'll do a follow on.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks for a great talk about a topic in the war I don't know much about. I really just wondered, you mentioned T.E. Lawrence a few times, but what precise role did he play in all of this?
The supplementary question, if you like, also on Lawrence, is from William Bentley. So William asks, was Lawrence fully aware of the consequences for the Arabs of the implementation of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and did in effect mislead them into supporting the Allied campaign? So I don't know if you want to combine the answers to both or deal with them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, the first part was Lawrence's overall role. So yes, basically this talk, obviously I've looked at from a very strategic theatre campaign-based movement of forces, and primarily from the British Army's perspective, or British Empire forces perspective. So Lawrence, for anyone who didn't pick up on my slide on the Arab Bureau, was basically an intelligence officer with the Arab Bureau, but he had connections, pre-war connections in the Middle East, particularly with the Arab world, and knew Prince Faisal, and basically had been working with the Arab Bureau to sort of get the Arab kingdom, the Hashemite kingdom, on board to support the Allies and rise up against the Ottoman Empire from within, and basically create a revolt which would help the British and French allies to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. And they agreed to do that. And he was really the British liaison who had made this promise that Britain would support Arab nationalism and the creation of unified Arab kingdom. But he also, in effect, served with the Arab revolt and rode with them and fought with them on many occasions out in the desert. But he was really a key linchpin in getting the whole Arab revolt to align itself with the Allied needs, Allied causes, and he very famously leads or travels with the leadership, Faisal, in the Arab revolt's move alongside the eastern flank of the British assault up through Palestine and into Syria. As I mentioned, he was a little bit annoyed with the Australians for capturing Damascus. He really wanted a glorious victory for the Arab army there. And he sort of writes Australia a little bit out in his recollections of those events. But he is continuing even after the war to try and meet Britain's original promise of supporting the Hashemite kingdom and their creation of a unified Arab state. And there is a hypothetical argument to be made that Middle Eastern history might have been different. Obviously there's the Sunni Shia divide within the Middle Eastern world, and religion would have had to be taken into account as part of that. And also obviously Persia is a separate, modern day Iran is a separate occasion. So when you're looking at or a separate entity religion-wise as well. So when you're talking about what might have happened in the Middle East, conflict may have ensued once the sort of suppression of the Ottoman Empire dissolved away anyway. Who knows? Someone mentioned the Pisani. I'm less familiar with his story. He was a French captain. I've got a funny feeling he was either Arab or North African himself. But he basically was played a similar role to Lawrence, but for the French. I believe he was effectively, he was an Arab speaker. And I think he basically was the equivalent of Lawrence. He was their liaison officer. I think essentially he continued to serve with them as Lawrence did throughout the campaign. I'm afraid was the question what happened to him. I'm not sure I actually know what happened to him after the war, but I do think he may have gone to the Paris Peace Conference as well. So I assume effectively his war was very much a French version of Lawrence's, as far as I know about the story.
Thanks for that. You've covered Susan's question about Pisani there. Thank you very much, and thanks also for covering Angela Hall's question there about Lawrence in such detail. So thanks for that. Right, next let's go to William Anderson and the question that William's got. So William, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you, David. I'm calling from Virginia. Appreciate the opportunity to join you guys. Really enjoyed, Rob, your presentation last week as well. And I'm kind of a student of the German participation in the campaigns. I'm wondering if you would think what the impact on the Arab uprising was on the Sinai campaign of 1916. And the reason I mention that is that Kress von Kressenstein in his memoir mentions that he had a continuing battle with Jamal Pasha about diverting supplies down south on the railroad rather than supporting his troops in the Sinai campaign.
Yeah, I think really the real momentum of the Arab revolts comes in the sort of Palestine and Syria phase. They do absolutely already start to have an effect whilst the war is still going on in Sinai. They're already attacking the railway, for example, and diverting Ottoman troops away through raids and that sort of thing. And in particular, I think one of the key things they're doing also is providing intelligence of Ottoman movements. I can't remember the exact number, but I think before the beginning of 1917, one of the real problems that Hussein has is that he actually has a very large force. I think it's some 50,000 men. But until Britain and France are able to get larger supplies of rifles to them, a lot of those men weren't equipped with modern weapons. So they were held back, I think, particularly in attacking strong Ottoman formations by not having enough arms and ammunition. But once I think the support in terms of material and logistics starts coming in, the Arab revolt really starts to gain more and more momentum and becomes much more effective. Yeah, I think I can't remember if there's any actual direct involvement in Sinai, but certainly along the Hejaz Railway and attacks along the Ottoman supply lines and lines of communication, they're already beginning even during the Sinai campaign.
Well, I think in the the Romani campaign, there were several Ottoman units that hadn't eaten in 3 days.
Yeah, yeah.
That's because they couldn't get the rations to them from Kadia or Beersheba.
Yeah.
With they had,
Yeah.
but other ones that didn't have enough rations to give to them because rations were being sent south.
Yeah,
But,
absolutely.
Thank you very much.
So that's already really, as you say, already undermining the Ottomans' ability to operate forward in the Sinai quite early in this campaign. In fact, that obviously was the part of this overall campaign that I covered last week. So yeah, we were already talking about very early on the Arab revolt really starting to cause them significant difficulties.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, William, for joining us from over the pond. Much appreciated. Thanks very much. We've got no further questions that I can see. So with that in mind, I think what we'll do is just do a further thank you via the old hands up routine, just as a final thanks to Rob for an excellent presentation. I for one have got an awful lot out of that because, as a few people have mentioned, we haven't touched on this. Well, I've touched on it once in a previous webinar, but not for quite a while. So it's good to look at a new theatre of war, and you've really explained that to us very well.
David, if anyone didn't catch my email address before, I am very happy for you if they get in touch to forward that. If you do have any questions that you either didn't get a chance to ask rather, or you subsequently think of something you might want to touch on, do just feel free to get in touch with me. I'm happy to do that.
Perfect. Thanks very much. I'll gladly facilitate that. So yes, the next WFA webinar, probably the last before October, because we'll make a pause at this juncture during the summer months. But if we do have a burning desire to do another webinar, we'll let everybody know. But the last one in this current round will be on the 5th of June, and it'll be Professor David Stevenson looking at the final stages of the war in Western Europe and analysing the factors that led to the armistice. So if you haven't already registered for that, please do so. Rob, again, my sincere thanks for your time, both this week and last, and we'll get this in the can and we'll put it on YouTube in a few weeks' time. So very many thanks indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for watching. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armitage, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armitage, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armitage, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on Hickey, Armitage, parlez-vous. Out on Hickey, Armitage, parlez-vous. Out on Hickey, Armitage, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get